Welcome to Carbon Politics, a CSE podcast series decoding the politics of climate change from the lens of the Global South. In this series, we will explore multiple critical questions that are surrounding and pressuring the climate debate today. What happens next on multilateralism, or where is the current trade system going? And how does the global financial architecture need to be reformed? How are these systems influencing the ability of developing countries to address, respond to, and adapt to climate change? These are some of the critical questions we hope to answer, and we hope you join us on this journey this year.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of CSE's Carbon Politics podcast. My name is Sehr, Raheja. I'm a program officer with the climate change team here at CSE. And for today's episode, which is called Climate Finance Can Be Expensive, Demystifying Cost of Capital for the Global South, I have with me a very special guest, Neha Khanna from the Climate Policy Initiative India. She's Associate Director and has over 15 years of experience in green and sustainable finance. And she's also deeply committed to the climate cause, which is why we've invited her here today. Welcome.
Thanks, Sehr.
The main question that we want to unpack in today's episode is one of the issues that we hear when we're talking about climate finance, particularly in the context of developing countries, is this high cost of capital, particularly for green technologies, particularly for the global south. So truly today, the question we're trying to answer is it really too expensive to fund climate action in the global south? Or is the high cost of capital another symptom of how elements of the global financial system are stacked against these countries by design? So let's get into it. To begin with, I'd like to ask you, simply if you could tell us, when we're referring to high cost of capital, especially for green technologies for the global south, what exactly is the problem here? What are we talking about when we hear this as being a barrier for climate action?
Okay. First of all, thanks. Interesting topic and a very relevant one, especially given the focus that has increased, and rightly so, and thankfully so, over the last few years on funding technologies which are moving more towards green, which are moving more towards the 1.5 degree pathway. Now, if I take that answer and unpack it a little bit, because it's not a simple answer, fortunately or unfortunately. Most countries at this point will need green finance and something called as transition finance.
Okay.
Because we acknowledge that especially the developing economies need to transition. So expecting them to shut down fossil fuel today is unrealistic. It cannot work.
Yeah.
Energy security, livelihoods, jobs,
Energy poverty,
everything. It's a interconnected situation that we're talking about.
Yep.
And at no point should one action lead to challenges in another sector or another area. So if we talk about that, in that case, the element of transition finance becomes exceptionally important, especially in the global south.
Yep.
Now, when we talk about cost of capital, we will hear people say cost of capital for global south is very expensive. Great. Awesome. Fair point. But again, let's unpack that. Countries have domestic sources of finance and international sources of finance.
right?
And if you look at India, so CPI does tracking of landscape of climate finance.
Yep.
We find that for the last 6 years, which is how long we've been tracking, the domestic sources of finance for India account for anywhere between 83 to 87%, whereas international sources account for anywhere between 13 to 17% only.
Right.
So, what does that mean? And I'm now talking first India context and then I'll take it to the global south context.
Perfect.
So, what does that mean? That basically means that domestic capital is more. Now, in the case of domestic capital, then it is not then attributed to a country. It is not attributed to our status as a global south country. It is just sheer risk return paradigm which we're talking about.
Yeah.
Even then, the challenge on cost of capital being high for green and for transition remains.
Okay.
Now, why is that? When equity or debt comes in, they will do a risk assessment.
This is to fund anything. Like we're
Fund
talking
anything.
about countries and we're talking about green
Anything,
technology, but it
any
applies to,
any
financials
funding,
in
yes.
general.
Any
Financials.
funding
Yeah.
that needs to happen has to have a risk return
Correct. Yeah.
paradigm, right? Every loan, every investment that is done, forget banks and forget financial institutions. When you and I, when we do our personal investment, we also try and understand what is the risk.
Yep.
What is the chance that my money will remain safe and give me good returns.
Correct.
The riskier the proposition, the higher the returns, and vice versa. That's a traditional
Finance thing.
concept.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with green.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of it. The risk return, the concept of mitigation adaptation, finance really did not start looking at it as mitigation adaptation. They look at it as a simple, do my returns justify the risk I'm taking?
Understood.
So now in the domestic context, why is it still a challenge? Because these are newer technologies. And typically an area which would have grown over, let's say 5, 10, 15, 20 years, now needs to fast track and grow in 5 years.
Yeah. So when we say green technologies, we're talking about like solar energy, solar panels, wind turbines,
EVs,
electric
energy
vehicles.
efficiency,
Yeah.
climate smart agriculture related products.
Everything. It could be anything.
Anything to do with mitigation adaptation and anything to do with air pollution.
Got it.
Right?
Yeah. So now, sorry, you were saying that they will now need to get fast tracked in.
So now they need to get fast tracked, which means that what would have typically been market forces at play need supplemental support to ensure that the perceived risk, and I say perceived because actually nobody can actually quantify the risk 100%, right? Because these are newer technologies. You really don't know whether the offtake will be there or not.
Understood.
Which is why the simplest case to understand this concept is large-scale solar in India.
Okay.
The government of India created enabling policies. And what that did is, in the last 10 years, it has brought down the cost of large-scale solar to such an extent that they do not need any support, whether it's from a government perspective, policy perspective, or a regulatory perspective. They don't need a boost
anymore.
They are able to go out and be commercially viable and commercially competitive. Which basically means that if they are commercially competitive, when a funder or an investor has to choose between investing in project A or project B, the tag of green or a new technology is not applicable anymore. Because it's a proven technology, it's an established one. You have offtake agreements, you have the demand side sorted, and you have and because you have the demand side sorted, so the supply side is also comfortable around it. Now, but fortunately or unfortunately, when we talk about green, it's a huge spectrum of technologies, which means you will have technologies going from technology readiness level of 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 12 or even more. The cost of capital starts varying.
Okay.
Again, going back, if we look at it as an investment, when we also look at an investment, we want to be safe. So those who want to play it safe, which is typically debt, those investments will be attracted or move towards technologies which are established. And hence your cost of capital will reduce. Can I say that all of this is applicable only to green? No, this is a concept that the financial sector uses to evaluate all projects. I think what makes it complicated where we talk about green is, so now mitigation has given us use cases, whether it's EVs, whether it's clean energy, solar, wind, hydro, whether it's battery storage, or whether it's solar pumps, which are viable and have a return case. But there are enough where the business returns are not as clearly identified or understood.
Right.
I'm not saying they don't have returns, they're not as clearly understood. So hence they add to the risk and hence they add to the cost of capital, which is why green is perceived to be risky.
Okay.
Now, interestingly enough, a few studies outside of India have actually shown that lending to green has lower NPAs.
Lower?
Lower non-performing assets.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Which means lower defaults, which technically means
it's not that risky.
It's not that risky.
Oh my God.
However, it's still small. It's not a widespread study. It is only specific
samples and regions
and all that. So, but that does mean that tagging green as risky
is not even...
I think that's the thing that I would, if I could dispel one thing, I would say it's not about green being risky.
Yeah.
It's just a simple concept of when investment happens or when lending happens,
Yeah.
you do a risk evaluation, and the risk parameters right now are such that they end up being higher.
Right.
So it's not that something which is green and is inherently risky.
Okay.
It's just that these are things which, okay,
Green itself is
it's a new concept.
Yeah.
It's developing, it's growing.
Yeah.
If we go back in time, when you had cassette players, and when you transitioned to CDs,
Yeah.
CDs transitioned to MP3.
Correct.
It was a natural progression.
Yeah.
It happened.
Yep.
Nobody had to come in and step because there was no timeline attached to it.
Mm,
Climate,
that's true.
has a
a timeline, a very, very urgent
it
one.
is a very urgent timeline,
Right.
which is why
Yeah.
we focus so heavily on saying that the cost of capital is high and needs those interventions.
Got it.
Because we want to fast track it, and some of these technologies may not get fast tracked or may not be market ready at the time which we need them to be for the current crisis that we are facing.
And the time we need them to be ready was yesterday. So
Yes.
we're already...
So we're already late.
Got it. Perfect. I think that's very, very helpful. Thank you for that. I think that's a very good explanation of the domestic picture. And this is specifically for India, you were mentioning.
Yes.
So I think the next question then I would like to ask would be about how is it on the international level? Meaning what is it like for different developing countries?
Sure.
And honestly, we just want to understand what are the factors that are making this cost of capital high. Of course, you explained the risk return paradigm, but on a global scale, why is it considered expensive still to drive, or catalyze this transition for developing countries? Is it really because of a lack of domestic action and support by developing countries, or is it because of other reasons like sovereign credit ratings, perceived risk, and the whole design of the various elements? Yeah.
Okay. So we spoke about India, but we also have to acknowledge the fact that globally, most of the developing economies don't have the wherewithal to mobilize that level of domestic finance for climate.
Okay.
India, China, these are bigger economies.
Right.
They have greater domestic sources and are able to mobilize more. So where more international capital is needed, additional concerns get added to the mix. Now, you mentioned something around sovereign credit rating, which is a perfect segue actually, because even where India is concerned, we do not get the right cost of capital, and I say right in quote unquote because that's debatable what is right and what is not, but we get a higher cost of capital purely because of two components, sovereign risk plus political risk and forex risk. So if that is true for India, and India is one of the more stable, quote unquote stable,
relative to the
other developing economies. And I say quote unquote stable because the concept of credit rating, sovereign credit rating in itself has multiple areas which can be discussed at length. And we have seen that the government has raised issues on India's sovereign rating, right? Rightly so actually in quite many ways, to be fair. But if we now take that and say that we want more international finance to flow to developing economies, for every developing economy, the sovereign rating will impact the premium associated with it.
Okay.
So the lower your rating, the higher the premium that will be added.
Yep.
CPI had done a study about 2 years ago. This was just on solar projects. And it said that the cost of capital spectrum for a solar project, taking everything as status quo, ranges from 3% in Germany to 52% in Argentina.
52.
52. Why? Because the sovereign rating for the country plus the uncertainty in the currency, because these are international loans, these are not local currency loans.
Right. Yeah.
So these are usually dollar denominated or euro denominated or basically non-local currency denominated loans, which means that when your forex fluctuation happens, the payout increases substantially. Very rarely will it happen that the fluctuation is going in favor of the developing country.
Yeah.
Now the question is that, have these factors come out of the blue for climate? No. But they add, because climate, like we spoke about earlier, because there's uncertainty in the basic concept itself.
Yep.
So that leads to a higher cost of capital. Plus you add the sovereign risk.
Yeah.
Plus you add political uncertainties. So the same developer in a developed economy will be considered more stable, and whereas that same project being implemented in a developing economy will have a higher risk associated with it, right? Because of multiple enabling condition and factors.
Yeah.
And so for an investor, and the investor is going to come and say, but because I perceive it to be higher risk, I'm going to have a higher cost of capital.
Yeah.
So where international capital is concerned, this is a genuine problem. And what we had proposed, and this is something that was discussed earlier as well, CRMM was proposed, which was a guarantee risk mitigation mechanism.
Okay.
But that was bundling all the risks. So what we proposed is that you create a global guarantee mechanism. What that will do is it is sitting outside all countries. It's supranatural.
Okay.
Because it's sitting outside countries, it can actually de-risk the sovereign risk component of it. For political, you have MEGA.
Yeah.
For
World
FX, you have players like TCX and others. No solution is perfect. There is going to be challenges and criticism in all solutions that you come up with, and that's true. But this was something that we felt could at least address some part of the problem and help in reducing the cost of capital to developing economies from developed.
So have a supranational entity to absorb or kind of
Have
take
a
on,
pool of money which can, so have a structure and all of that.
make up for that.
Yes.
But before you continue, I want to take you back to this term you used. You said the perceived risk. Now it's
Yes.
interesting that perceived sounds like a subjective kind of term, right? But when
Yes.
we're talking about investments like we were talking earlier, it's usually it's just economics, it's just a financial risk return equation. So could you just tell us a little bit more about this perceived risk for the global south?
So why I use the term perceived is because you can't prove either which way whether it's risky or not. Right? Like I said, there are studies which show that lending to green actually has lower non-performing assets getting created.
Right.
Is that going to be true in all cases? Maybe, maybe not. So hence, when we are talking about it, we preface it by calling it perceived risks because that's the perception. Is it a completely subjective thing? Absolutely not. Risk management it's a mix of subjectivity plus objectivity.
Yeah.
And there are quantification
Of course.
mechanisms that exist.
Right. But I think I just brought up the subjectivity part because I think there is some literature that has shown, and including a study that CSE did a couple of years ago, which says that there are aspects which are left to subjective assessments.
Always.
And so they are kind of, there is enough scope, and it has been seen that there is a sort of bias against EMDs or developing countries in certain ways. Of course, not to denounce the entire economics of it, but that's why.
There is a subjectivity, and that has to be included because it's if we were to make everything objective, I don't think that would serve the purpose either. Because there are nuances in So you have evaluation criteria. That's very set. But okay, you as an investor can have a higher degree of risk absorption. I may have a lower degree. So where does that fit into my portfolio? So when we talk about all of this, it's not just a single component or a single aspect. It's actually multiple things that we have to take into account.
Yeah, understood. Perfect. So thanks. And with that, I think I'll come to our final question for you for today, which is that we've established developing countries, first of all, have a climate finance gap. And the money that does come in is, like you were saying earlier, it's often in the form of market rate loans. For India itself, or external finance, first of all, is very less. What comes in is also primarily loans, and within that, primarily market rates. So really the amount of grants or concessional finance for developing countries for climate action is really low, which means that it's not just a quantity problem, it's also a quality of finance problem. And this is something we keep hearing at international climate negotiations, economic governance, reform conversations and discussions as well. So like you were just saying, the picture does vary by country though. It's not a uniform thing. Even though we're using the words developing and global south here, every country, it kind of varies. So In India's case, how much of a barrier really is the high cost of capital for climate action? I know you touched upon an example at the start, but in a broader sense, how much of a barrier would this particular problem be? And if it is, then what are some ways of addressing it? Or, what has been done? What do you think should be focused on from a policy perspective or otherwise?
Okay. So, from an India perspective, if we are just talking India,
Yes.
the MDB lending to India has become actually for larger projects. There are enough instances that we have heard of people say that it's cheaper to borrow domestically than to rely on MDB lending at times, because MDB lending requires a guarantee by the government of India to be put in. That also has there's a cost associated with everything that you add on as a de-risking mechanism. So, are we only getting market rate loans? A larger chunk of it, but I would again break it down into a certain nuance, right?
Please,
we graduated to an LMIC status, which means that some of the concessionality that we were getting earlier, we're not eligible for because of the categorization that we are in.
Yeah.
Right or wrong,
that's a separate
thing. These are mechanisms that have existed. I'm too short a conversation to get into the veracity of all of those things.
Yeah.
But that has been a factor. Do we need more concessional capital? 100% we do.
Okay.
Purely because, and that concessional capital, I would look at it as two parts. One is the international aspect of concessional capital, and the other is the domestic aspect of concessional capital.
Right.
I think concessional capital will be required for multiple types of projects, especially when we are looking at adaptation, let's say. You cannot, adaptation is primarily going to be the government.
Yep.
However, there is a strong private sector involvement that is there, and that can be there in adaptation.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
And we have, we've done studies around it. We're actually currently doing some work around that as well, on saying how can the private sector be more involved? Not just from a financing perspective, but also from the real sector perspective. Now, if that is the case, even within domestic, we need some concessional capital to come to have blended finance structures getting designed for adaptation.
Yeah.
Blended finance structures also getting designed for other areas, which again need a fast track to happen. So concessionality is needed. From an international capital perspective, yes, it would be, I mean, wish list, if I could have, obviously it would be great if we could have more concessional capital come in, because it just helps us fast track a lot of climate action that needs to happen.
So even if not just concessional, is when we say affordable,
I would actually add another angle. I would say patient capital, long-term capital would even be more helpful.
Yeah.
Because
for a country like India.
For a country like most developing countries need long-term patient capital.
Okay.
But again, if you're looking, see, capital comes in various forms and manners. If you're focusing specifically on the MDB space, yes, their rates as we had conversations, they're not as competitive. It is cheaper to pick up in India, which is why it's happening. Does that mean they don't have a role to play? I think they do. Also, another aspect which is which we're now talking a lot more about, but which we have been practicing since 2017 and supporting, is something called as technical assistance.
Right.
It is being increasingly understood and accepted, and now being incorporated into project design, that when lending is being done, add a technical assistance component to it.
And what exactly does that entail?
So technical assistance would mean it's usually non-financial support, but capacity building.
So this is also written into the convention and the Paris Agreement, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, same.
But hadn't really picked up a lot of focus in the first 5 years.
In practice also.
But now it's picking up a lot of focus. A lot of the line of credits that MDBs and DFIs are doing, they're pivoting in that, including more and more of technical assistance than ever before,
right?
Which is important. One of the reasons why the transition mechanisms in the past have not been as successful is that they have had more market rate loans. Maybe 90-95% of the amount is market. 2 to 3% is technical assistance, and 2 to 3% is a grant.
Wow.
Right? But that paradigm has to start changing a little bit. Now, before I get called out for saying why concessionality, because to be fair, I'm a very market-driven, I'm very, very convinced on the market theories.
Sure.
The reason for concessionality and for the technical assistance especially is, again, the criticality of the timelines that we are dealing with.
Yeah.
If we do not do this, we're all going to suffer. There's a lot to be said about technology transfer. Concessionality doesn't always have to come in form of cheaper money. It can come in form of technical assistance. It can come in the form of technology transfer agreements that can happen. And we are seeing a lot of focus and emphasis on trade agreements in the last few years, right?
Yeah.
Very, very important and crucial to get those right.
Yep.
Very important to ensure that the support that is coming is helping India or any of the developing economies sort of pole vault
Yeah.
or basically skip a few steps, because
Yeah.
if we were to follow the traditional steps, it is going to have its own challenges.
And it's going to be too little, too late,
late,
on
yes.
various
Yes.
accounts.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks a lot. It's been great to have you here. And I hope that India and other developing economies can find the solutions that they need. Because I think, yeah, the main thesis or the bottom line is that we don't have enough time. And anything that can be done to catalyze, transform, catapult, whatever word you want to use,
Yes.
but fast track
Fast track.
the action and support, that's what we'll need. So thank you.
Thank you so much.